Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. The fire flickers and burns in the hearth tonight. Beyond the window, winter darkness presses close, thick and cold as the grave. A wind rises from the north, rattling the old glass in its frames, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howls once, then falls silent. Over the years, I've collected many accounts of Scotland's haunted places, letters, journals, testimonies from those brave or foolish enough to seek out the supernatural. But there is one collection that stands apart from all the others. A series of encounters documented by a single traveller who visited 4 of Scotland's most haunted castles in the space of just 4 nights. What makes these accounts remarkable is not just what was witnessed, but how carefully the history was preserved alongside the horror. This traveller understood that Scotland's ghosts are not simply to frighten, they are there to remind us, to teach us, to ensure we never forget the injustices that created them. Tonight, I'll share these accounts with you exactly as they were written, a journey into castles where the dead refuse to rest. It began at Glamis. They say that Glamis Castle holds more ghosts than any other fortress in Scotland, and I came to learn whether this was mere superstition or something more. The journey from Edinburgh had taken several hours through countryside that grew progressively more wild and remote, until at last the castle appeared before me in the gathering twilight. A magnificent structure of towers and turrets rising from the fertile farmland of Strathmore, its fairy tale silhouette belying the darkness that dwelt within. Autumn mist lay thick across the land, turning everything grey and indistinct, and as my car drew to a halt on the gravel drive, I sat for a moment in the sudden silence and became aware of a sound that seemed to drift from the castle itself. It was faint, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakable once heard. The sound of a woman weeping. The guide who met me at the entrance was young and professional, her manner friendly as she welcomed me to what had been the seat of the Lion family since 1372. She spoke of royal connections and historical significance as we entered the Great Hall, explaining how Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had grown up within these walls and how Princess Margaret had been born here. But as we walked deeper into the castle, through corridors lined with portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow our passage, I noticed that her voice had grown quieter, and her practiced smile had begun to falter. The temperature dropped with each step we took. My breath began to mist in the air, and though the guide made some comment about unreliable heating in the older sections, we both knew it was not the heating that caused such cold, The weeping I had heard outside grew louder, more distinct, until we could both hear it clearly. A woman's voice, choked with grief that seemed to have no end. "The family chapel," the guide said at last, pushing open an ancient oak door. "Janet Douglas, the Grey Lady, is most often encountered here. I will wait outside, if you don't mind. Some of us have seen her too many times already." I stepped across the threshold alone. The chapel was small and intimate, lit only by the fading daylight that filtered through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in shifting patterns of deep blue, rich red, and sombre purple. Wooden pews faced a simple altar where 2 candles burned with flames that remained perfectly still, despite the draught I could feel moving through the room. Everything was quiet, too quiet, with the kind of silence that seems to press against one's eardrums and make each heartbeat sound impossibly loud. Everything, that is, except for one seat. In the 3rd pew from the front, on the left side of the chapel, something was present. At first it appeared as merely a distortion in the air, like heat shimmer on a summer's day. But as I watched, scarcely daring to breathe, it grew more solid and distinct. A shape, a woman's form, kneeling with her head bowed, as if in prayer or penitence, her hands clasped before her, though they trembled with the force of her silent sobbing. The smell of smoke filled the chapel, old smoke, the acrid scent of burning wood, mingled with something far worse that I dared not name, a smell that seemed to emanate from nearly 500 years in the past, and yet remained fresh, as if the burning had happened only moments before. I took a step closer, and the floorboard creaked beneath my weight. The figure in the pew grew clearer still. She was dressed in grey, a simple gown in the style of centuries past, and as I drew nearer, she slowly raised her head and turned to look at me. The face that met my gaze was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, pale as moonlight, with eyes reddened from weeping and cheeks streaked with tears that would never dry. But it was the expression she wore that stopped my breath in my chest. Such sorrow, such rage, such absolute and utter despair that I felt my own eyes begin to sting with sympathetic tears. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and though no sound came from her lips, a voice filled the chapel, a voice that seemed to rise from the very stones themselves, from the air, from everywhere and nowhere at once. Innocent. The word echoed through the sacred space and through my very bones. I burned innocent, and then she was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been, leaving only the penetrating cold and the faint smell of smoke that lingered in the air like an accusation. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking so badly I feared they would not support me, and found the guide standing in the doorway with a face as pale as the ghost we had just encountered. "You saw her," she said, and it was not a question. "Janet Douglas, Lady Glamis, the grey lady who will not rest." She led me to a bench in the corridor outside, and there, as we both tried to still our trembling, she told me the story I had read in fragments, but now heard complete. Janet Douglas had been sister to Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, the man who had imprisoned the young King James V and treated him with such cruelty that when the king finally escaped and took his throne, he swore vengeance upon the entire Douglas clan. Janet's husband, John Lyon, died in 1528, and immediately whispers began that she had poisoned him. Whispers that served the king's purposes well, though the charge was eventually dropped when no baron could be found willing to serve on a jury against her. But James would not abandon his revenge. He had Janet arrested on charges of treason, claiming she had plotted to poison him and had aided her exiled brothers. The actual trial records from July 17th, 1537, show she was convicted on these charges despite the flimsiness of the evidence. To secure testimony against her, the king had ordered her servants and family tortured, and some accounts suggest that even her own 16-year-old son was subjected to such torment that he gave false witness against his mother, though modern historians debate the truth of this particular detail. What is certain beyond any doubt is that on July 17th, 1537, Janet Douglas was led to Castle Hill in Edinburgh, bound to a stake and burned alive before a great crowd of witnesses. Contemporary records note that she died with great commiseration from those who watched, and that her innocence was widely believed even as the flames consumed her. "She returns here," the guide concluded, her voice barely above a whisper, "to the place she called home, to the chapel where she once prayed. Staff and visitors see her constantly, weeping in this chapel, standing in the clock tower, gazing out over lands she once knew, walking the corridors in search of something she will never find. And that seat where you saw her, it is always kept empty. It is reserved for her alone. Those who sit there by mistake report feeling as though they are sitting upon someone's lap, someone who should not, cannot be there." A sound from somewhere above us made us both fall silent. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pacing back and forth across the floor directly overhead, though we both knew that section of the castle was closed and locked, that no living soul walked there. The footsteps continued their measured tread, and then came a sound that made the very walls seem to shudder, a roar of such rage and anguish that I clapped my hands over my ears. though it did nothing to block out that terrible cry. It seemed to come from the inside of my own head, vibrating through every bone in my body. Then silence fell once more. "Earl Beardie," the guide managed to say, though her hands shook as she spoke. "We should leave this place. We should—" But I was already moving toward the stairs, drawn by a compulsion I could not name and did not truly wish to resist. The guide followed reluctantly, and together we climbed to the upper gallery, where the portraits of long-dead lions watched our passage with painted eyes that seemed somehow more alive than they should have been. The corridor was dark, despite the lamps that burned at intervals along its length, and the shadows seemed too thick, too solid, as if they possessed substance and weight. From behind a door at the corridor's end came sounds that should not have been: the rattle of dice against wood, the slap of cards being dealt, and a voice rough with drink, cursing in an archaic form of Scots that I could barely comprehend. I should not have opened that door. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to flee, to run from that place and never return. But my hand was already on the handle, already turning, and the door swung open to reveal a room that was empty and yet somehow terribly, impossibly occupied. There was no furniture visible, no table or chairs, no cards or dice that I could see with my mortal eyes, and yet I could sense their presence with a certainty that defied all reason, could feel the shape of them in the air itself, as if the room held the ghost, not just of people, but of objects, of events, of a scene that played out eternally in some dimension just beyond the reach of normal sight. The temperature in that room was beyond mere cold. It was the cold of the grave, of absolute emptiness, of places where warmth and life had been banished forever. Ice crystals formed on the windows, even as I watched, spreading across the glass in intricate patterns that looked almost like grasping fingers. And there, though I could not precisely see them, I knew they were present, sat two figures at a table that existed and did not exist. One was massive, bearded, with eyes that burned red like coals in a dying fire. The other was tall and dressed all in black, and where its face should have been, there was only shadow. Not the shadow cast by absence of light, but shadow that seemed to possess its own terrible substance and purpose. The story came to me then, whispered by the room itself, by the stones that had witnessed and would never forget. This was Earl Beardie, his true identity lost to the confusion of centuries. Either Alexander Lindsay, 4th Earl of Crawford, who died in 1453, or Alexander Lyon, 2nd Lord Glamis, who died in 1486. The historical details did not align perfectly with the monstrous figure of legend, suggesting that the ghost story had merged details from multiple sources or attached itself to whichever Earl seemed most dramatically suited to the tale. But whoever he had been in life, in death he was terror incarnate. The legend told that he had loved gambling more than God himself. One Saturday night, deep in his cups, he had demanded a game of cards, despite the approach of midnight and the Sabbath. His companions had refused, warning that to gamble on the Lord's day was sin. But Beardie's rage had been terrible to behold. He had roared that he would play cards until doomsday itself if he must, that he would play with the devil himself if no mortal man would join him. And then had come a knock at the door. A tall man, dressed all in black, had stood in the threshold, his face hidden in shadow, and had asked in a voice like grinding stones whether the Earl still required a partner for his game. What happened next was known only through the accounts of terrified servants who had heard the sounds from outside that locked room, cursing and shrieking, furniture crashing, and noises that seemed not quite human, echoing through the night. One servant, braver or more foolish than the rest, had dared to look through the keyhole, and a beam of searing light had shot through that tiny opening and blinded him in one eye. When morning came, Earl Beardie had been found alive but changed, his soul forfeit to his dark visitor, and when death finally claimed him, he had not passed on to whatever judgment awaited. Instead, he was doomed to play that eternal game in a room that could not be found, but that persisted nonetheless, won by the devil and lost to the world forever. The dice rattled again in that impossible room, closer now, and a voice like gravel dragged across stone whispered words I could not quite distinguish, but whose meaning was terribly clear. It was an invitation, a command, a demand that I sit and join the game that would never end. I ran, down the corridor, down the stairs, the guide's white face appearing in the lamplight as she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the exit with surprising strength. We did not stop until we stood outside in the cold winter air, both of us gasping as though we had run for miles. "There is more," she said when she had caught her breath. "There is always more in this place. The secret rooms where something dwells that should not exist. The chamber where the Ogilvy clan was sealed and left to die. The woman without a tongue who haunts the courtyard. The frozen child who sits forever on his stone bench. This castle does not let go of its dead or of its visitors." She handed me a card with an address written in faded ink. "Edinburgh Castle, the next on your journey. If you're still determined to pursue this, if you still wish to know what dwells in Scotland's ancient stones." As I drove away from Glamis that night, I glanced in my rear-view mirror and saw a window on the 3rd floor slide open. just a crack, just enough. And in that narrow opening, something watched me leave, with eyes that glowed faintly red in the darkness. The drive to Edinburgh took 2 hours through the countryside, growing ever darker, and I spent that time attempting to convince myself that what I had experienced at Glamis had been nothing more than hysteria, born of suggestion and atmosphere. But the memory of Janet Douglas's face, of Earl Beardie's impossible room, of the cold that had seeped into my very bones, these things would not be dismissed so easily. I arrived in Edinburgh as the last light bled from the sky, and the city's lights began to sparkle like earthbound stars. The castle sat atop its volcanic rock, like a clenched fist raised against the heavens, black against the blood-red remnants of sunset. For nearly 1,000 years it had stood guard over Scotland, and research from 2014 had counted 26 sieges in its 1,100-year history, more than any other stronghold in the world. Its walls had run with blood, its dungeons had held thousands, kings and queens had been born there, had plotted there, had died there, and the dead, as I was beginning to understand, had never truly left. My contact met me at a side entrance after the last tourists had departed for the day. He was an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, though he might have been older, with a face like weathered stone, and eyes that had seen far too much, and yet could not look away. He had been the night watchman at Edinburgh Castle for 40 years before his retirement, he told me, but they still called him when someone wanted what he termed the real tour. We entered through a small door that he unlocked with a key that looked older than either of us, and immediately I felt the difference between the castle by day and the castle by night. The shadows were deeper here, more substantial, and the stones seemed to absorb sound in unnatural ways, so that our footsteps echoed strangely, sometimes too loud, sometimes barely audible, and never quite matching the rhythm of our actual steps. It was 1650, the old man began, as he led me into a moonlit courtyard, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times, but never losing its power to unsettle. Oliver Cromwell's army was marching on Scotland, and everyone knew what was coming. The castle prepared for siege, strengthening its defences, laying in supplies for what would surely be a long and terrible ordeal. He stopped in the centre of the courtyard and gazed around as if seeing something I could not perceive. Then one morning, the servants looked out into this very courtyard and saw him, a boy, no more than 10 years old, wearing a drummer's uniform. He marched in circles, beating his drum with mechanical precision. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, the sound echoing off these ancient walls in a rhythm that never varied and never ceased. The old man paused, and in that silence I thought I heard it, faint and impossibly distant, the ghost of a drumbeat carried on the wind. The servants moved closer, curious and concerned in equal measure, wanting to know what the boy was doing and why he marched alone. And that was when they saw it, when they came close enough to see clearly what their eyes had tried to refuse from a distance. He turned to look at me directly, and I saw in his expression that he believed every word he spoke. The boy had no head. Where his head should have been, there was only empty air, but still he drummed, round and round in endless circles, never pausing, never tiring. The servants fled in terror, and when they returned, with others brave enough to investigate, the boy was gone. A warning, I said quietly. Aye, a warning indeed. By Christmas Eve of that same year, Cromwell's forces had taken the castle. The headless drummer had been an omen of the disaster to come, and since that day he had appeared only at times of great upheaval. The last confirmed sighting was in 1745, shortly before another military catastrophe. But on quiet nights, when the tourists have all gone home and the castle stands empty, those of us who have worked here can still hear him drumming somewhere in the darkness. As if in response to his words, the sound came again. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, still faint, but unmistakably present. The rhythm of a drum beaten by hands that no longer existed. My skin prickled with more than just the cold, and the old man nodded grimly. Come, he said, there is more you need to see if you truly wish to understand what dwells in this place. The tunnels beneath the castle hold their own horrors. He led me down spiral stairs, worn smooth by centuries of passage, descending into darkness that my phone's light could barely penetrate. The beam seemed to stop after just a few feet, swallowed by a blackness that felt almost solid in its density. The air grew cold and damp, clinging to my skin like cobwebs, and the smell that rose from below was of earth and age and something organic. The sweet, sick scent of decay that made my stomach turn. The walls pressed close as we descended, the tunnel narrowing until I had to turn sideways to squeeze through the passages where my shoulders brushed against stone that was cold and slick with moisture. The old man moved ahead with the confidence of long familiarity, his flashlight beam dancing across rough-hewn rock. These tunnels wind through the volcanic rock beneath the castle, he explained, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. No one knows how far they extend or where they all lead. Some say they run all the way to the palace of Holyrood House at the far end of the Royal Mile, but they're dark and unmapped, and as you will soon understand, they are not empty. We came to a place where the tunnel branched, offering a choice between left and right, both disappearing into darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. Centuries ago, the old man continued, they needed to map these tunnels to know if invaders might use them to gain access to the castle. So they found a piper, a young boy, small enough to fit through even the tightest passages. They gave him his bagpipes and simple instructions. Walk through the tunnels while playing so that those above could track his progress by the sound. I could almost hear it already, or perhaps I was truly hearing it, a faint melody that might have been pipes, or might have been wind, or might have been nothing more than the wishful thinking of an overstimulated imagination. The boy entered the tunnels with his pipes and began to play. The haunting wail of the music drifted up through the rock, and people followed the sound along the Royal Mile above, tracking his progress as he moved steadily beneath their feet, heading toward Holyrood. The old man fell silent for a long moment, and the darkness seemed to press closer. The weight of all that stone above us, suddenly oppressive beyond bearing. Then, somewhere near the Tron Kirk, halfway between the castle and Holyrood, the music stopped. The silence that followed his words were absolute, pressing against my eardrums until my own heartbeat sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. A rescue party was sent down immediately. They searched for hours, then days, then weeks. They found nothing, no body, no pipes, no sign that the boy had ever existed beyond that final note that echoed up from beneath the Tron Kirk, before fading forever into silence. From deep within the left-hand tunnel came a sound that made my blood run cold. Bagpipes, faint and mournful, playing a melody I had never heard and hoped never to hear again. The music grew slowly louder, slowly closer, moving toward us through the darkness with patient, implacable purpose. He still plays, the old man whispered, and I could hear the fear in his voice, despite his 4 decades of familiarity with this place. Forever searching for a way out of the darkness, forever lost. We need to go, now. I needed no further urging. We fled back up those narrow stairs, the sound of pipes following us, echoing up through the depths like a cry for help that would never be answered. When we finally emerged into the courtyard, both of us were breathing hard and trembling despite ourselves. The dungeons, he said, after we had recovered somewhat. You wanted the full tour, and the dungeons are the worst of all. But I warn you, what you encounter there may follow you home. He led me down different stairs, deeper into the rock, into chambers cut from the living stone that had never seen daylight and never would. The air was thick there, hard to breathe, and the walls seemed to press inward, as if the castle itself was trying to crush us in its stone embrace. Names were carved into the ancient wooden doors, desperate scratches in the dark, final messages from the condemned. Je me souviens, remember me. French prisoners from the Napoleonic Wars, the old man explained. Americans as well, kept in conditions barely fit for animals. Many died down there, and they remained still, their voices echoing in the darkness long after their bodies turned to dust. A door at the end of the corridor stood ajar, though neither of us had touched it. Cold air seeped out from the room beyond, and with it came voices, whispers in French, in English, in languages I could not identify, all pleading, all desperate, all terribly, impossibly present. Help us, remember us, do not forget. Don't enter that room, the old man said, pressing himself against the far wall. Whatever you do, don't. But I had already taken a step forward, drawn by those pleading voices, by the weight of all that suffering, crying out for acknowledgement, for release, for an end to an imprisonment that had outlasted death itself. A hand touched my shoulder. I spun around, my heart hammering. The old man was 10 feet away, pressed against the wall, his face white as chalk. I did not touch you, he said. The hand squeezed, ice cold, insistent, desperate. Invisible fingers dug into my shoulder with the strength of absolute need, and I could feel through that touch the anguish of all those who had died in this terrible place, could feel their desperation to be remembered, to be acknowledged, to be freed. I ran up through the dungeons, up the stairs, out into the open air where I could breathe again and feel the stars above me instead of endless tons of crushing stone. The old man followed, wheezing, and when we were both safely outside, he began to laugh. Not a sound of joy, but of the recognition of shared terror. 40 years I worked here, he said when he could speak again. 40 years, and I never became accustomed to it, never stopped being afraid, never will. He straightened with effort and looked at me with something that might have been pity. There are other ghosts here, of course. The grey lady who walks these halls. Some say she is Janet Douglas, the same woman whose spirit haunts Glamis, her torment so great that she cannot rest in any one place. Others claim she is Marie de Guise, mother of Mary Queen of Scots, whose body was kept here for months, sealed in a lead coffin, while Protestant nobles refused to allow her Catholic remains to be shipped home to France. There is the prisoner who tried to escape, hidden in a dung cart, only to be thrown from the battlements to his death on the rocks below. There is the ghostly black dog that wanders the pet cemetery, forever searching for his master. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. Your next destination, if you are still willing to continue, Culzean Castle on the Ayrshire coast, if you have not yet had your fill of Scotland's restless dead. As I walked away from Edinburgh Castle that night, I heard it one final time. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. The headless drummer beating his eternal warning into the darkness. The drive west took me away from the city and into country that grew progressively more wild, until at last I reached the Ayrshire coast, where the land met the sea in a dramatic clash of cliff and wave. I arrived at Culzean Castle as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and purple, and my first thought upon seeing it was that surely nothing so beautiful could be haunted by anything terrible. The castle stood perched on the very edge of a precipice, a masterpiece of Georgian architecture designed by Robert Adam between 1777 and 1792. Its oval staircase swept upward in graceful curves, and its staterooms looked out over the Firth of Clyde towards the Isle of Arran, which was visible in the distance like a dark smudge against the horizon. But as I would soon learn, Culzean sat on older bones. This had been Kennedy land, seat of the clan Kennedy, since time out of mind, and beneath the elegant Georgian facade, the cliffs were honeycombed with caves that had once served smugglers and perhaps darker purposes still. Those caves went deep, twisting through the rock in patterns that no map had ever captured and no living person fully understood. The woman who met me was younger than my previous guides, perhaps in her early 30s, and she introduced herself as one of the brave or foolish souls who rented the castle's holiday apartments for those willing to spend the night surrounded by its ghosts. "You're here about the piper," she said, and it was not a question. "Among others," I replied. She smiled, though the expression did not reach her eyes. "There are always others in a place this old, but the piper is the one you will remember longest, I think. Come, he is best encountered at the source." She led me down a winding path cut into the cliff face, so narrow that in places I had to press myself against the rock wall, feeling it cold and rough against my back, while the drop to my left fell away into darkness, where waves crashed against stone with the sound of distant thunder. The wind rose as we descended, howling through crevices in the cliff and carrying spray that stung my face with salt. At the base of the cliff, a great dark opening gaped in the rock, the entrance to the caves. Even from a distance, I could feel the wrongness of it, the sense that this was a threshold between the world I knew and something far older and less forgiving. "The story," my guide said, as we approached that terrible opening, her voice barely audible above the roar of the sea, "tells that locals once whispered of spirits dwelling in these caves, things that came out with the tide, lights that moved in the depths, voices singing when no living soul was near. To prove these were nothing but superstition, They sent a piper and his dog to walk the length of the cave system, from this entrance here to an exit on a distant hill that is now called Piper's Brae. The cave mouth was enormous, easily 20 feet high and 15 wide, yet somehow it felt constraining, as if the rock itself wished to swallow anything that entered and never release it again. The darkness within was absolute. My phone's light seemed to stop just a few feet inside, as if hitting a wall of solid black. The piper entered with his dog at his heels, and he began to play his pipes, she continued. Those waiting on the cliff top above could hear the music drifting up through the rock, moving beneath their feet as the piper progressed through the cave system, steady, sure, never faltering. She paused, and in that moment the wind shifted, and I could have sworn I heard it, the distant skirl of bagpipes playing a wild, joyful melody. And then the music stopped. I waited, knowing what must come next, knowing and yet still feeling the chill run down my spine. The pipes fell silent, but the dog was heard barking, frantic and afraid, and then even that sound ceased, and there was only silence. The bagpipes grew louder, clearer, unmistakably present. The tune was both beautiful and terrible, speaking of joy and grief, and warning all woven together in notes that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something deeper. They waited for the piper to emerge from the exit at Piper's Brae, but he never appeared. A search party entered the caves and found nothing. No piper, no dog, no trace of what had befallen them in the darkness. She turned to look at me, and in the fading light I could see the fear in her eyes. But the piper did not remain silent. On the eve of Kennedy family weddings, his pipes can be heard drifting up from these caves, playing in celebration of a clan he served in life and serves still in death. And on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the sea rages, he plays again. Not celebration this time, but something darker, sadder, more desperate. As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared for just a moment on the distant rise of Piper's Brae, a solitary silhouette against the darkening sky, pipes raised to lips that might or might not still exist. And then he was gone, faded like smoke on the wind. We returned to the castle in silence, climbing back up that treacherous path as darkness fell completely. Inside the elegant rooms seemed a world away from the raw power of the cliffs and caves below, but the sense of unease remained, a subtle wrongness that no amount of Georgian refinement could entirely mask. "The state bedroom has been prepared for you," my guide said as she led me through the castle. "It is the most haunted room in Culzean, though whether that is a selling point or a warning, I leave you to determine." The room was elegant, 4-poster bed, antique furniture, windows overlooking the sea. But standing in the doorway, I felt the wrongness intensify. The air was thick, watchful, charged with anticipation that made my skin prickle. People wake in the night, she explained, convinced that someone is standing at the foot of their bed, watching them with terrible patience. But when they turn on the light, there is never anyone there, or at least never anyone they can see. Has anyone ever seen anything here? I asked. Oh yes, a woman in a ball gown has been witnessed drifting through the corridors, appearing solid and real until she walks through a closed door, as if it were nothing but air. In 1972, multiple witnesses reported seeing a misty apparition moving up the grand oval staircase, and another was seen descending those same stairs 4 years later. Some believe these sightings are connected to a young woman who met her end in the green room, though historical documentation of such an event has proved frustratingly elusive. She walked to the grand staircase and ran her hand along the banister with obvious reluctance. And then there is the portrait, Margaret Erskine of Dun, wife of the 12th Earl of Castle.The. It hangs at the top of the stairs, a beautiful painting in the style of the period, but those who pass beneath it report a feeling of being watched, and some claim that her eyes do more than simply follow. They say her foot shifts, tracking movement across the landing, and that sometimes a cold mist forms beneath the portrait and slowly takes on a vaguely human shape before disappearing. I looked up at the portrait, a stern woman in Elizabethan dress, beautiful in a cold and unapproachable way. As I watched, I could have sworn, but no, surely it was merely the flickering of the hallway lamps, playing tricks with shadow and light. There is one more ghost you should know of, my guide said quietly. The White Lady. She is believed to be a servant girl who was cruelly mistreated during her life at the castle. Exactly what was done to her, no one now living can say, but her spirit lingers in the corridors near the kitchens, always running, always fleeing from something we cannot see. Those who encounter her say they are filled with the most overwhelming desire to help, to protect, to save her from whatever pursues her. But she vanishes before help can be given, and the feeling of helpless pity remains long after her form has faded from sight. That night, alone in the state bedroom, I attempted to sleep, but found rest impossible. The bed was comfortable and the room was warm, but I could not shake the feeling of being observed by eyes I could not see. At 3 a.m, I woke from a restless half-doze, with the absolute certainty that I was no longer alone. At the foot of my bed stood a figure, darker than the darkness around it, possessing no features I could distinguish, but unmistakably present. It stood perfectly still, watching me with an attention so focused It felt almost like a physical touch. My hand fumbled for the light switch, trembling so badly I nearly could not find it. The click when it finally came sounded impossibly loud in the stillness, and the light flooded the room. Empty. Of course it was empty. But the air where the figure had stood was ice cold, and when I looked down at the thick carpet, I saw them clearly, footprints impressed into the pile as if by considerable weight, leading from the foot of the bed to the wall and through it. I arrived at Stirling Castle on the 4th night of my journey, exhausted in body and spirit. Sleep had become difficult, and when I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with grey figures and burning flesh, with the sound of drums and pipes echoing endlessly through darkness. Every shadow made me start. Every unexpected sound set my heart racing. Yet I could not abandon the journey now, not when I was so close to understanding what these haunted places were truly trying to tell me. Stirling Castle sat upon its volcanic rock like a crown above the town, visible for miles in every direction. The castle that controlled Stirling controlled Scotland, they said, for whoever held the strategic height commanded both the Highlands to the north and the lowlands to the south. It had been a royal palace, a military stronghold, a seat of kings. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been crowned here as a helpless infant, and her son, James VI, had been baptised within these very walls. My guide for this final castle was a historian, a woman of perhaps 50, with grey streaked hair and the no-nonsense manner of one who dealt in facts and documentation rather than speculation and folklore. She greeted me with professional courtesy and began the tour with a recitation of dates and historical events, speaking of Stirling's strategic importance and architectural significance as we walked through the royal apartments. The Green Lady, she said, with a tone that suggested she had explained away the superstition many times before, is a product of oral tradition and confirmation bias. People expect to see something anomalous in old castles, and so they interpret perfectly natural phenomena through that lens of expectation. But even as she spoke, the temperature began to drop, dramatically and suddenly, until our breath misted in the air before us, and I could see the goose flesh rise on my guide's arms. The heating system is quite old, she said, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. It can be unreliable in some of the older sections. A smell began to fill the corridor, smoke, thick and acrid, like burning cloth, like burning flesh. The historian's professional composure wavered visibly as the scent grew stronger, more unmistakable. The story, she continued, her voice now barely above a whisper, claims that a servant to Mary, Queen of Scots, saved the Queen's life one night. A candle near Mary's bed set the curtains aflame, and within moments the room was engulfed. The servant, her name has been lost to history, rushed into that inferno, tore down the burning curtains with her bare hands, and pulled Mary to safety, even as her own clothing caught fire. The smoke smell intensified until I could taste it, until breathing became difficult and my eyes began to water. Mary survived, the historian managed to continue. The servant did not. She died from her burns, her body consumed by the flames that had been meant for her queen, and according to the legends that have grown up around that sacrifice, she walks these corridors still. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she looked like an ordinary woman, dressed in the simple green wool of a servant's gown. But as my eyes adjusted and truly focused on what stood before us, I saw the truth that made my guide sob aloud, and my own stomach turn with horror and pity. The green of her dress was not the green of life or growing things. It was the green of corruption, of flesh that had burned until the very fat beneath the skin turned that horrible, sick colour. Her face, what remained of her face, was blistered and charred, the skin peeling away in strips to reveal raw tissue underneath. Her hair was gone, burned away to leave only a blackened skull. Her hands reached towards us, skeletal fingers wrapped in burned and melted flesh, beckoning, pleading, desperate for something we could not give. When she opened her mouth to speak, her lips cracked and split, and instead of words, grey smoke poured out, smoke that smelled of burning meat, smoke that had been trapped inside her for centuries, smoke that would never stop billowing forth from lungs that had inhaled nothing but fire and agony in their final moments. But there were words there too, carried somehow in that smoke, whispered directly into our minds, in a voice that was raw and ruined and filled with infinite sadness. Run while you still can. And then she was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been, leaving only the lingering smell of smoke and a cold that penetrated to the very marrow of her bones. The historian was weeping, silent tears streaming down her face as 40 years of certainty crumbled around her. I didn't believe, she whispered. 40 years I've worked in Scottish heritage sites. 40 years I've told people that ghosts were just stories, just folklore, just the human mind seeing patterns in randomness. But I saw her. I saw her. A door somewhere in the castle slammed with tremendous force. Then another. Then another. A cascade of slamming doors moved through the building like a wave, each impact echoing through the stone corridors, the sound growing closer and louder until it seemed the very walls would crack from the force of it. We must leave, the historian said, her scholarly composure entirely abandoned now. We must leave this place at once. We ran through the corridors that seemed to shift and change as we moved through them, past portraits whose painted eyes tracked our flight with what might have been amusement or pity or hunger, down stairs that seemed to multiply beneath our feet, stretching on forever, as if the castle itself was reluctant to let us go. Finally, mercifully, we burst out into the courtyard, beneath a sky full of cold stars. On the ramparts above us stood a figure, a man, dressed in full Highland costume, kilt and sporran, and all the traditional accoutrements of a warrior. He stood perfectly still, looking out over the town, as if standing guard against some ancient threat that only he could perceive. The Highland soldier, the historian gasped. People mistake him for a historical reenactor, approach him to ask questions about the castle's history. As we watched, the figure turned to look down at us. Even from that distance, I could see his eyes, dark voids that held nothing of life or humanity, that looked out from a face that might once have been human, but was human no longer. And then he simply ceased to exist, not walked away, not moved out of sight, simply stopped being, as if he had never been anything more than a trick or shadow and starlight, though we both knew better. The historian looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. "What are we?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What are we really? If the dead do not rest, if stone holds memory, if sorrow and violence soak into walls and persist for centuries, what does that make us? Are we the living walking among the dead, or are we the dead who simply haven't realised it yet?" I had no answer for her. I had no answers for anything anymore. The journal ended there, with the traveller driving through the night and Janet Douglas watching from the roadside. I've thought a lot about these accounts since I first read them, about what it means that people keep seeing the same figures in the same places, century after century. The grey lady in the chapel, the drummer on the ramparts, the piper in the caves. Are they real? I don't know. I wasn't there. But I do know that the history is real. Janet Douglas really did burn. Children really did serve in those castles, and some of them died in terrible ways. Prisoners really did suffer in those dungeons. These tragedies happened, whether or not their victims still walk. Perhaps what we call hauntings are just the way stone and story work together to keep memory alive. Perhaps these castles don't need actual ghosts. The weight of what happened there is enough to make the air feel cold, the shadows seem deeper, the silence more profound. Or perhaps the dead really do linger in places where they suffered, unable to rest until their stories are heard and understood. Either way, These accounts have taught us something important, that every castle holds sorrow as well as grandeur, that Scotland's history is written in blood as much as glory, and that remembering the difficult parts of the past is just as important as celebrating the beautiful parts. Janet Douglas deserves to be remembered, not as a ghost, but as a woman who died unjustly. These stories, whether supernatural or not, serve that purpose. They keep memory alive. They remind us that real people lived and died in these places, and that their lives mattered. That seems to me a worthwhile haunting. Rest well tonight, and if you ever visit these castles yourself, take a moment in the quiet places. Listen to what the stones remember. You might be surprised what you hear. If you enjoyed this journey into Scotland's haunted past, please consider sharing it with others who love Scottish history and folklore. Like and subscribe to Caledonia Sleeps, and join me again as we explore more of Scotland's mysteries, more of its legends, more of its soul. Sleep well. May your dreams be gentle, and may the ghosts of Scotland's castles rest a little easier, knowing their stories have been heard. Good night.